Welcome to our 22nd session of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. For those of you who are here for the 22nd time or less time, we're happy to have you coming back. And for those of you here for the first time, it's also pleasant to see you. We have gone through the, we're working on the big picture of the Old Testament because you have to understand the big picture before you can understand the individual parts. Now, we've come up through all the covenants, and we are now in. We talked about the prophets, finishing with Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel, the last of the three great prophets of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah in reverse chronological order, finished prophesying about 570 before Christ, or before Common Experience, BCE. So that's basically 570 years before the birth of Christ. Now, why I mentioned that relationship to Christ when we're talking about the Old Testament is that I did say we're going to spend some time looking at Jesus from a Christian interpretation as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. And so we have to set the groundwork for that. Especially, we've had done that with the big picture because you have the covenants we've been talking about going all the way back to Adam. And how does Jesus fit into all of those covenants? Because right now there's not going to be a new covenant, at least from the Christian perspective. And so we're talking about now the time between the last prophet and Jesus. God was still at work. Now, the prophet Daniel was only a little younger than Ezekiel and prophesied shortly after him, roughly 30 years after the death of Ezekiel. Daniel received a vision from God that it would take about 500 years, 70 weeks of years, for all the prophecies to be fulfilled. Deuteronomy 9:24 through 27. And so it did. Of course, a lot happened in that time. In 539, about the time Daniel was having his vision, the Persians conquered the Babylonians and took over the Middle East. The Persians were nicer than the Babylonians and let all the captured peoples go home, including the Jews. And this is what is called by the return from exile. Led by Prince Zerubbabel, and as I said last time, notice how even Jews are taking names, pagan names, but the names that include pagan gods. That shows what happened with this idolatry being so widespread. Now, the prophet Ezra and the aristocrat Nehemiah. Many other prophets and noblemen were in the returning group. And they didn't all come as one. They came in kind of waves, immigration type of waves. And so those waves started in the late 500s and basically finished in the late 400s. So we're not talking about all of a sudden everybody's home. And that meant that the people who got there earlier knew the rest were coming, and so they were involved in kind of making preparation. By 515 BCE, they had built another temple on the site of the old one. It was kind of like a shack in comparison, but the one that Solomon put up. But at least there was a place to worship God again. Now, the return from exile had its good points and its bad points. On the positive side, the Jews had a lot of their land back. They had a temple to worship God. On the negative side, they didn't have a Davidic king on the throne, and their temple was a disappointment. And there was no sign of the new covenant and the glorious new temple, which the three prophets had promised. In fact, the Jews weren't even able to rule themselves. At first, they were under the power of the Persians, and then after Alexander the Great swept through the Middle East in the 330s, they were ruled by him and his Greek-speaking successors. However, two events gave rise to false hopes that the predictions of the great prophets were about to be fulfilled. In the 160s, one of Alexander's successors, King Antiochus IV, whose capital was in Syria, took a hard line against the Jews he ruled. And you can see that in particular in the book of Daniel, with Daniel standing up on the second floor of his home or building and opening the windows to pray and challenging Antiochus IV, and the young men going into the fiery furnace and things like that. So if you want to know about this time period, you will look more in detail into the book of Daniel. Now, but I gave you this. He took a hard line against the Jews. He tried to make them give up their religion, to become like the Greeks. The Jews revolted against the leadership of a family of revolted against this kind of leadership. The revolt was led by a family of Levites. You remember Levi, and that was the priestly line, not the Davidic line, and they were known as the Maccabees. The Maccabees fought a guerrilla war against the armies of Antiochus and eventually drove them out of Israel. See 1 Maccabees. For the next 100 years, the Maccabees ruled as kings, and they expanded the kingdom of Israel almost to the boundaries it had under David and Solomon. Things were looking pretty good for the Jews at that point. They had their kingdom, they had most of their land, their temple was up and running. Once again, they were prosperous. Just one little problem. Their kings had the wrong genealogy. They were Levites, not sons of David. And the covenants, especially the ones that David, showed that it would be a Davidic king. So there's no way the Maccabees could fulfill the prophecies. Their power ended in 63 BC when the Romans captured Jerusalem and divided the land of Israel into several provinces. Shortly after the Maccabees, the hopes of the Jews were raised once again when the Maccabean dynasty was declining and losing its grip on the land of Israel. A certain Herod, a nobleman from the south, went to Rome and had himself appointed king of Israel by the Romans. With the help of the Roman army, he gained control of the Jews without much difficulty and reigned quite successfully for about 30 years, about 37 BC to 4 BC. Once again, he extended the borders of Israel almost to the size of the kingdom under David and Solomon. And what's more, he began to rebuild the temple on a massive scale, a temple even more impressive than Solomon's temple of old. Again, things seemed to be going well for the Jewish people and nation. They had their kingdom back, more or less. They were building a new temple. They were prosperous. Only one nagging problem that keeps coming back. Herod had the wrong genealogy. He wasn't a son of David any more than the Maccabees were. He wasn't even a true Jew. He was a descendant of Esau, Jacob's hairy twin brother, Genesis 25. There was no way that Herod or his successors could be the fulfillment of all the prophecies. Their rule effectively ended in 66 AD. The last of the Herods died in 92. We see that in the time between the last prophet and the birth of Jesus, there had been some high points, as though the prophecies might soon be fulfilled. In each case, however, the nagging difficulty, the ruling family was from the wrong bloodline. For the prophecies to become true, they needed a descendant of David who could restore the Davidic covenant. Now, maybe we can better understand why the New Testament begins with the words, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, for most of us, genealogies are boring. We don't really care. As a matter of fact, on the Sunday that's read in church, you probably want to say, why? And want to fall asleep. But if you were a Jew in ancient times, and you've been waiting for hundreds of years for a man with the right bloodline, this genealogy is anything but boring. Taking a closer look, say, at St. Matthew's, he chooses to begin his biography of Jesus, which we call the Gospel according to Matthew, with the phrase, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, the son of Abraham." Notice he does not call Jesus a son of David or a son of Abraham. There were plenty of sons of David, even more sons of Abraham, because every Jew was a son of Abraham. They were descendants of David all around. So, and some of them are mentioned by ancient historians for various reasons. But Jesus just wasn't any descendant of David or of Abraham. He was the son of David, the son of Abraham. In other words, he was the promised one of David and Abraham, who would fulfill all of the prophecies of the two great covenants. By calling Jesus the son of David, the son of Abraham, this verse Matthew mentions only David and Abraham. In fact, Jesus fulfills all of the expectations associated with each of the great covenants we have looked at in the Hebrew Scriptures. So let's just take a moment and walk through each of these covenants and see how Jesus fulfills them. Now, as you remember, the first covenant is with Adam. Adam, the father of the human race, who held a five-fold role as the son of David. He was a king. He was a priest. He was a prophet, a bridegroom, and a son of God. Jesus is the father of a new race of humans. And if we read the Gospels carefully, we see repeated signs that Jesus holds all five of Adam's roles. It's clear from the beginning. Matthew believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Although he is the legal son of Joseph, Matthew 13 through 36. He is the actual Son of God through the power of the Holy Spirit. The point of the virgin birth, Matthew 1:38, confirms that God the Father confirms Jesus' sonship also at his baptism, when he speaks in an audible voice from the heavens, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Matthew 3:27. God the Father repeats almost the same words at Jesus' transfiguration. Matthew 17, verse 5. Because of his special sonship, Jesus calls his God Father, especially while praying. Matthew 6, 9, Matthew 11:23 through 27. Jesus even calls God Abba, and that's in Mark 14:6. Abba. That's the word that children use to call their male parent. You know, we seem to go through stages. When you're an adult, you call him father, sometimes by his name. Before that, when you were a teen, he's kind of like dad. But a child, it's daddy. And each of these names mark a different kind of relationship. Jesus calls God daddy. Well, and he's teaching us how to pray. So that's what we're supposed to call God daddy, our daddy. And a daddy is different than a dad, because as we become more and more independent, our words become less and less endearing. Daddy is a very endearing term. So we give up daddy to become dad. Well, with God, Jesus is saying we need that daddy kind of relationship. That relationship a little child has with its male parent. What is that relation? First of all, it's totally dependent. It can do nothing on its own. And so it needs a parent to take care of those things. One of my favorite stories is when I was growing up, preschool age. One of the big arguments we'd always have is my daddy is better than yours. And I remember the neighbors that we had. One's father was a policeman, and one's father was a fireman, and they were arguing which daddy was the greatest, and mine, because my father was an insurance agent who handled claims, so that after the police and firemen left the mess behind, my father cleaned up everything and made it good for the people. And so, that's kind of relationship we're supposed to have with our daddy who's in heaven. Okay. It's clear that Jesus is a king, because he's the son of David. Both Matthew and Luke provide Jesus' genealogy going back to David. So he's of a Davidic line. Jesus' genealogy is about the angel Gabriel, who says to Mary before his birth, the Lord God will give to him the throne of David his father, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. Luke 1:32. During his lifetime, many people recognized his royalty, calling him Son of David, especially after he performed miracles like exorcisms. Matthew 12 and 15. Nearing the time of his suffering and death, Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem, intentionally imitating the great Solomon of old. Matthew 2:12 and 17. And you got to see 2 Kings 1:38 through 40. Ironically, even the Roman governor acknowledged Jesus as king, not as intentional, but more as a statement of his crime. Pilate had put on Jesus' cross the title, King of the Jews. Now, saying that Jesus is a priest is kind of a little harder to do, except that Christian interpretation is, he offered the sacrifice his life. But in terms of the Davidic covenants, all the covenants, especially the one with Adam, how do you see that? Well, the Pharisees challenged Jesus for breaking their Sabbath rules about rest. Jesus says, "Have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" Matthew 12:5. Jesus points out that the priests are allowed to work on the holy days. In fact, they have to work on the holy days. Gee, it sounds like priests today. Um, in fact, the implication is that Jesus himself is a priest and has priestly rights. Later, at his crucifixion, the Apostle John mentions that Jesus' robe was without seam, woven from top to bottom. John 19:23. What's the point of this insignificant little detail? Why even mention it? It's because in ancient times, the robe of the high priest was woven without seams. Jesus' garment was a sign of his high priestly role. The letter to the Hebrews discusses this point in great length. In fact, some have even argued that's the main point of the whole work. No one doubted that Jesus was a prophet. Very clear. He was good at saying prophetic type of statements. When Jesus is asked, "Who do people say that I am?" the disciples provide a list of various prophets. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Matthew 16:23. Jesus calls himself a prophet. When he was scorned and ridiculed by his own hometown, he says, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house." When Jesus finally rides into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the crowds announced, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Matthew 21. Finally, Jesus is the bridegroom. When questioned about Jesus, John the Baptist explained, "You yourselves bear me witness." They said, "I am not the Christ. I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine now is full. He must increase, but I must decrease." John 3:28-30. Jesus himself suggests he is the bridegroom when he tells the parables about the kingdom that are based on the wedding image. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gives a marriage feast for his son. Matthew 22 and following. The kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Matthew 25:3. Jesus is the new bridegroom who offers himself in marriage to all humanity. To be married to Christ is to become part of the church, to become part of his bride. Son of God, King, priest, prophet, and bridegroom. Jesus fulfills all of the roles of Adam. That's why he's referred to as the new Adam. With Jesus, we begin a new chapter in the history of humanity. In fact, it is more than a new chapter, it's an entirely new beginning, a new creation. For that reason, St. Paul says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Likewise, St. John begins his gospel with the words, in the beginning was the Word, which are an imitation of the opening line of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. St. John's point is that Jesus marks such a radical turning point in human history. It is like the whole human world has just started over. Actually, St. Matthew makes almost the exact same point as St. John in the very first verse of the New Testament, although the point is made quietly, so it is easy to miss. St. Matthew begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The phrase book of the genealogy of occurs only in one other verse of the Bible. And, Matthew would have definitely known